Good morning. Today we're going to begin by taking a look at the first chapter of the textbook, Inventing America. And we're going to do that by first taking a look at the general introduction to what is referred to as Part 1, or Empires. And I would suggest that every time the book presents you with one of these parts, that you take the time to consider, what are the major themes that are going to be developing over the next several chapters. And so for the next minute or two, we're going to try and get a handle on some of the major themes that are suggested by way of Part 1. And the first thing that is really reinforced here is that by and large, whether it be the Native Americans or the Europeans, the real emphasis on what was going to be happening in the Americas was going to be an emphasis on survival. And of course, this had a lot to do with adapting to the various environments. And so one of the reasons that we see such great complexity with Native American settlements prior to the Europeans arriving is because they had become so adept at adapting to the environment and really putting the focus on survival. And in some cases, as we'll see, particularly in South America, the civilizations that flourished were quite complex and quite interesting in terms of their technological development. Of course, we all know that the Europeans eventually will sail west and will do so by utilizing some of their great technology, particularly in navigation. And of course, when the Europeans ran into the Americas after it dawned on them that they had this new continent to explore, or set of continents rather, they began to become very, very effective at doing several things. One of the things that they were very good at was extracting the mineral wealth of the New World, and that'll be very important, particularly for the Spanish. Another thing that they were extremely effective at doing was setting up trade routes and trading systems with other Europeans, but also Native Americans, and of course agriculture, which will be one of the great secrets to the English success in the New World, the idea of really developing agriculture in the New World. Of course, the fact that there was so much going on by the time that the Europeans arrived, the fact that we had many different types of Native Americans, some of which were assembled into great empires, the fact that we incorporated European empires into the mix, particularly Spain, France, and England, the stage was set for kind of a cataclysmic showdown between these empires. Now, we all know how the story turns out. The Native Americans are not going to be the victors in this process. Instead, it will primarily come down to the strength of the Europeans. But of course, the story of which Europeans win out is a very important idea. We will find that the Europeans that seemed perhaps least prepared to dominate the New World will dominate the New World. And of course, this will be the English. They will not only be able to fend off the Spanish, who will dominate South America, but also eliminate their great rival in North America, France. And of course, that will take place within the context of what is known as the French and Indian War. Of course, after the French and Indian War, we'll see that there will be a split within the English Empire, what we can now refer to as the British Empire. And of course, that will have to do with the British colonies and the British mainlanders arguing over just how much freedom and independence should be accorded to the colonists. So several important themes stressed here: the idea of survival, the idea of this imperial contest between empires, and of course what will eventually be a internal division with the most successful empire of them all, the British Empire. And so lots of good themes that will be developed over the course of the next several chapters, and well worth your attention and consideration. Now to the chapter that we're really concerned with for today, and that would be, of course, Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is all about three major themes. One, what was going on with the Americans, and I'm speaking here of Native Americans, pre-Columbian Americans, what was going on with the Native Americans prior to the Europeans' arrival. The second major theme is what was, of course, the impulse behind the Europeans setting out from Europe. What were the basic motives for them to become active in the New World? And then finally there's a third theme, and that third theme is, of course, what happens as a result of the Europeans kind of colliding with the Native Americans in what becomes known as the Columbian Exchange, something that will benefit Europeans far more than it does Native Americans. In fact, the effect on Native Americans will be quite catastrophic when you factor into it the idea of disease and war and conflict. And so those are the themes that we're going to be taking a look at in Chapter 1. Now, to get started here, we have to understand that even the Native Americans themselves were, of course, migrants to the Americas. So one of the things to always keep in mind in the study of American history, but also world history, is that all the folks who find themselves in the Americas, whether it be north or south, are migrants, are immigrants, if you will. So our story for the entire year is by and large an immigrant story. Now, of course, it all has to do as to when you arrived here. As we know today, there are many people in the United States who are what we would consider first-generation immigrants. But even if we were to consider the oldest migrants of all, Native Americans, we would have, if we traced it all the way back, we of course would see that they go back to the time of the great crossing from Asia into the Americas. And of course, that's how we come to have the civilizations that will develop in the Americas. A couple things that are always surprising, I think, to students of world and American history are the relative strengths and weaknesses of the Native Americans and the Europeans. One thing that we know that the Native Americans lacked and makes the study of their history so terribly difficult is that almost without exception, you can make an argument for the Mayans, but without exception, just about every Native American civilization lacked a real system of writing. So when you consider the idea of recorded history, there isn't a lot to go on, and so we have to rely on anthropology and the study of genetics. Biologists become important here because we don't really have a written record to work from. I would have you contrast this with things that you have studied in world history, where you studied ancient civilizations such as the Europeans or the Sumerians or any number of ancient civilizations. Most of what we know is based on what they wrote down about themselves. Sometimes cracking the code of that writing can be extremely difficult, but at least there's a code to crack. For many Native American tribes, there simply wasn't. Nonetheless, we know that Native Americans, through their oral histories, had creation stories that are probably not too far off from what the Europeans were dealing with in their Judeo-Christian tradition. When we think about the Bible, Native Americans had creation stories that centered around the idea of a great spirit and that was oftentimes used to explain how things came to be in the Americas. In a more scientific sense, we now know that probably 15 to 20,000 years ago, what we now refer to as Native Americans, which would have been Asian immigrants at the time, crossed over from what is present-day Russia into Alaska over something known as the subcontinent of Beringia, or the Beringia landmass. This was by and large because you had a ice age situation in which a lot of the ice had been frozen at the northern and southern poles of the world, and this allowed for sea levels to drop, and in this case sea levels dropped enough that these migrants were able to cross the fairly short distance from Russia into present-day Alaska. Of course, eventually the end of the Ice Age would come about 9 or 10,000 years ago, and of course this would create massive flooding and pretty much cut off the original route that Native Americans took. Of course, the story of Native Americans after crossing into the Americas is one of exploration and adaptation. And of course, over the next several thousand years, Native Americans would migrate all the way down to the southern tip of South America, and this, of course, would create a lot of the complexity that we see in the Native American experience, because the geography, if you consider the geography of two continents here, the Americas, is quite distinct. As anyone who's traveled even around just the United States would know, lots of different regions, and of course that will lead to lots of different adaptations. Of course, hunting was the first adaptation, so to speak, and there were lots of large animals that existed that the Native Americans hunted for quite a while, but of course many of these animals died out when the Ice Age came to an end. And then, of course, we know that by about 9,000 years ago, agriculture started to take hold, and we started to see more and more robust trade routes develop between Native Americans. And so we started to see a level of complexity emerge in certain areas, particularly in Central and Southern America, that developed into some pretty great civilizations. So typically, when we talk about the complexity or some of these great civilizations that developed, we're talking about what we would normally describe as Central Mexico, what is known as the Tehuacan Valley. This, of course, would be the area that we would see some of the earliest agricultural civilizations take hold. We started with, in some cases, the descendants of the Olmecs creating some of these agricultural conditions. Of course, we know that there was a great city of Teotihuacan that was pretty much online as of about 2,000 years ago. Of course, eventually, these great cities will be conquered by the Europeans, and it should be noted that when the Europeans encountered these cities, they were oftentimes quite amazed by the complexity. They really did rival anything that Europe had. In fact, I think you can make a good argument that they surpassed much of what Europe had at the time of exploration. The Mayans, of course, were also heavily present on the Yucatan Peninsula. And of course, the Mayans did have a very sophisticated kind of form of science, if you want to argue that. The idea of astronomy and mathematics, a calendar system, which of course we know was very central to what people were thinking in 2012 when the apocalypse was supposed to come around. The Mayan written language, of course, did exist, and so if you want to argue that there was a form of writing in the Americas before the Europeans arrived, the Mayans would be the ones to look at. And they developed great cities, Chichen Itza, Palenque. These were great cities that the Mayans developed, and really represent some of the great complexity that, of course, went on. Eventually, when we talk about kind of present-day Mexico in terms of geography, we eventually talk about the very great empire of the Aztecs. And it's important to keep the Aztecs in mind because they're the ones that will be around when the Europeans arrive. And the Aztecs were descendants from the Toltecs, and they developed their great city of Tenochtitlan, which of course will become eventually the location in central Mexico of what we know as some of the present-day kind of greatness of Mexico City and other outlying regions. In North America, of course, the situation was different because we had different forms of adaptation. That's the real thing to keep in mind here. And Native American histories, oral histories, are pretty effective at talking about the journeys that took place in their cultures from east, or I should say from west to east, so approaching the Atlantic seaboard. So when we talk about that diffusion of people across the Americas, eventually we will see that in many ways the different civilizations that take place in North America will give us an incredible variety of adaptation. And so diversity, particularly in North America, which is where a lot of our story will take place, is going to be quite interesting. We could talk about some of the folks that settled in places like present-day Louisiana, in the Ohio Valley. If we talk about the Hopewell people, we could talk about even further north if we wanted to go up to places like present-day Alaska with the Eskimos and the Aleuts, the Pacific Northwest and the California coast, and of course the Southwest, which is where we will see some very interesting things take place. Eventually the Anasazi, who will create kind of adobe dwellings like Chaco Canyon, and Pueblo Bonito, which of course stood for beautiful town in Spanish. All of these were extremely varied and interesting civilizations that had lots of different technologies, things such as arrowheads, the Clovis point being probably the earliest feature there, but also, of course, we can talk about some of the other technologies that will eventually take place when the Europeans introduce things such as the bow and arrow and other things that the Native Americans will adapt to in a very meaningful way. Perhaps the last civilization that I really want to feature here before we get on to the Europeans arriving and how they changed the situation in the Americas is, of course, the Cahokians. Cahokia was a great civilization that also is a bit of local history for us. It's just over in Illinois. You can go to Cahokia Mountains. Maybe several of you have. It was, of course, the largest city in North America prior to the Europeans arriving. There were massive burial mounds and pyramids, and the Native Americans grew corn as they would elsewhere in the Americas, particularly down in Central and Southern America. And it was an extremely complex civilization, the Cahokian people. Now they, like a lot of Native American civilizations, rather mysteriously disappeared prior to the Europeans' arrival. And so when we talk about Europe coming into America, it's perhaps important for us to focus on just a few kind of remaining civilizations. So we mentioned the Aztecs earlier. Eventually, we'll talk about the Incans in Peru, particularly in the context of European conquest. And those will be some civilizations that existed. Obviously, the fact that many great civilizations had gone away caused many Europeans to wonder whether the Native Americans had ever produced anything on a scale of complexity like those of the Europeans. Of course they had, but this would remain mysterious, and it's really not until our own time that we've gained a little bit more of an appreciation of just what the Native Americans had prior to the Europeans' arrival. There is a rather disputed set of numbers about how many Native Americans existed prior to the Europeans. Some argue that there were about 1 million that lived in the Americas. Others, in North America in particular, others argue as high as 18 million. But the key here is to remember, as we kind of close out this first theme, that the complexity of Native American civilizations did exist, and that in some cases it was quite amazing what was produced. It's also important to keep in mind that the variety of the Native American experience really had to do with geographical adaptation, and that's why we will see some of the big differences between North, Central, and South America. When we talk about the Europeans arriving, it's important for us to remember that the Europeans actually arrived very early on. We can go back to the 800s and even around the year 1000 and talk about the Vikings making a quote-unquote discovery of America with things such as Greenland and Newfoundland up there in present-day Canada. Of course, that's typically not what we're referring to when we talk about the Europeans exploring America, because the Vikings never created real permanent settlements. So when we talk about the Europeans coming to America, I think we really need to see exploration as the book rightly points out, the central event of the Renaissance. And so that puts us squarely into the 15th century or the 1400s. And it's important to realize that there were not only intellectual reasons, meaning curiosity for the Europeans to go exploring, but also economic and religious reasons as well. And that'll be very important. One of the things that got the Europeans to think about exploration in a more serious manner was, of course, the Crusades. And it was in the context of the Crusades that we started to see the Europeans exposed to some of the wisdom of the ancients, you might say. After the fall of Rome, a lot of knowledge was lost, and that knowledge actually became warehoused in the Middle East with the Islamic civilization. So when we think about some of the insights of the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, or even Muslim scholars themselves, or even the wisdom of the East, if we think about China, a lot of that had been cut off from the Europeans. So when they engaged in the Crusades, they became reintroduced to a lot of old knowledge, and they became introduced to a lot of new knowledge that the Muslim civilizations had been working with for a long time. So while the Crusades, had obviously a religious significance. They also had a technological significance because they allowed the Europeans to begin to think more seriously about exploration. And we started to see this excitement really develop when it came to a couple early countries. Portugal would be the first. They would be very interested, as would all Europeans, in getting around a couple of obstacles to the east. The idea was, based on the new knowledge, there was a lot of great treasure in the east. We had, of course, had people like Marco Polo who had gone to China and seen all the riches of China. But it was hard to get there. It was hard to get there not only because of distance, but also because Muslims were oftentimes in control of the routes to the east. So if you think about the Silk Road, and you also had Westerners, the Italian city-states, places like Genoa and Venice, they were in control of the head of those trading routes. And so trying to break the monopoly of both the Italian city-states and the Muslim control of the trade routes, this was really the big reason for countries like Portugal and later Spain to really think about navigation in a more serious manner. So we see that very early on there will be people in positions of power of places like Portugal, people like Prince Henry the Navigator, who will sponsor navigation not only of going south down Africa, but then of course eventually turning east. And we will see that a lot of the technology that came along with the Crusades was navigational technology. And so Europeans became very, very skilled sailors because they were able to take advantage of technology that had either been lost or invented by way of Muslim civilizations. And here the book is very specific about two, the quadrant and the astrolabe, both of which were extremely important pieces of technology that allowed the Europeans to navigate the open ocean. Europeans had been very successful in navigating what we might say along the coast, but in terms of getting out onto the open ocean, this was a whole other matter. And so once you had the use of this technology and you had these kind of sponsored expeditions down the coast of Africa and then into the Indian Ocean going east, you started to see the assemblage of some very important things, particularly manuals of navigation, some of the ship design, including the Lantine sails that were very important. Mapping became more sophisticated, and what really started to take place was people began to really question what was possible. The Europeans were hungry to become successful in the world. They wanted to be in contact with great civilizations of the East, and they wanted to find an efficient way to do that. And of course, with the proliferation of printing, if we think about the printing press, and generally the release of a lot of this new knowledge in the 15th century, you start to have the context really developed for a guy like Christopher Columbus. And Christopher Columbus was an accomplished navigator, but he was not a particularly powerful person in Europe. In fact, he had to court kind of the power centers of Europe in order to eventually get some kind of support for his ideas. And Columbus essentially had one great idea, which was that it might be possible to sail west in order to get east. And Columbus was someone that had studied the navigational manuals and had come to the conclusion, based on some of the wisdom of the ancients, particularly Ptolemy's geography, that essentially the world was fairly small, and the distance between Europe and the East, knowing that of course the world was round, that was a distance that probably would be anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 miles. And of course, this was the idea that Columbus sold to the Spanish throne, and was able to get the support of Ferdinand and Isabella, who were just coming off of their reconquest of Spain, taking it back from the Moors, or the Muslims, who of course had captured part of Spain during the Crusades. They were now feeling very good and wanted to assert their power in the world, and so they decided to take a calculated risk on Columbus and go ahead and have him execute his theory, which was that you could sail west in order to get east. Of course, Columbus was just the start. We will see a variety of European explorers begin to follow in his footsteps and arrive in the Americas. We can talk about even England in a very early phase, going all the way back to King Henry VII, putting some support behind John Cabot, and of course it will be his son Sebastian Cabot that will eventually discover, so to speak, the Hudson Bay up in the north there. Fishing became a very important thing for the English in the Americas. Eventually France will push out into the Americas, and of course the Spanish will also do this as well. It's important to note here that the Portuguese, while they will have a presence in the Americas, particularly in Brazil, the Portuguese were very interested in continuing to go east. They had actually pursued the theory that was first, the idea that if you sailed around Africa, you could get to the Indies, and they really controlled that route. So the Portuguese stuck with the idea of going east to get east, whereas we know the other Europeans, continue to follow in Columbus's footsteps of going west to get east, and of course that allowed them to become dominant in terms of the Americas. Now, when we talk about the conquest of the Americas, we have to really key in on Spain, because Spain was extremely effective as kind of the first out of the gate. They were the ones that really began to get curious about moving past the islands in the Caribbean that Columbus had discovered and pushing into the continent of South America. And they had heard about great civilizations, were interested in seeing what these were. And so we talk about Cortez and the Aztecs, in which he was able to conquer the forces of Montezuma and push into the great civilization of the Aztecs and to take it over. And of course, it will be the conquest of the Aztecs that will provide the basic structure for what will become kind of the center of Spanish activity, and that is centered around what we now know as Mexico City. Tenochtitlan, the great Aztec city, is essentially Mexico City and will become the center of New Spain. There were other conquistadors, of course, too, and we all should know, I think, about the conquest that took place further south in Peru, where the Incans were overcome by the forces of Francisco Pizarro, and of course that will lead to some great treasure for the Spanish, because in Peru there will be great silver mines. There will be some gold as well, certainly further north when we consider the Aztecs, but really it will be silver that will be the precious metal that the Spanish are very, very effective at extracting out of the Americas. Of course, the Spanish also tried to conquer North America, but pretty much gave up on it, primarily because it was very, very difficult for them to figure out how to acquire wealth from North America. There weren't the great mineral deposits or cities that they had discovered in Central and South America. And so while we can talk about the Spanish influence on the Southwest, and we could talk about the Spanish in places like Florida, by and large, these were settlements that were largely abandoned when it came to their conquest. In fact, the only thing that the Spanish really kept in place in the Southwest and in places like Florida, but particularly the Southwest, would be some of these Catholic missions, because it should be noted, and the book does a good job of this, it really was a twofold mission for the Spanish: to acquire wealth, but also to convert the natives, and that is why they will, keep those places in North America kind of intact, despite having limited success in terms of creating real wealth there. Another thing to mention about the Spanish is that while they were very successful early on, it wasn't just their acquisition of wealth that is important. It's also the fact that they developed an imperial structure that many European empires will seek to emulate, and they relied on a system of forced labor, primarily with the Native Americans. The Inca Media system was a way of essentially controlling the Native Americans, having people, originally conquistadors, but then later folks that were, essentially great landlords in America for the Spanish, controlling the Native Americans, trying to squeeze work out of them. But of course, Native Americans were not always very compliant, and were not always a reliable source of labor because of some of the things that would affect them in terms of disease. And so the Spanish, following the Portuguese, who had actually developed kind of a modern system of slavery on some of the sugar islands of Africa, West Africa, will begin to incorporate African slaves into the Americas. And of course that will be a pattern that unfortunately will be repeated by most of the Europeans who follow. Particularly we'll see that the English will become heavily involved in the African slave trade. Now the great question is always, since we have these great civilizations in America, we have this great variety with the Native Americans, and then of course we have the Europeans coming into the situation in the Americas, why is it that the one group seemed to dominate the other, the Europeans over the Native Americans? Why was it not reversed? Some have even gone so far as to say, why did the Native Americans not discover Europe? Well, we can probably attribute this to the third great theme that this chapter develops, and that is the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, as the book says, is a vast, complex, intercontinental transfer of goods, plants, animals, and diseases that occurred after 1492. If we think about what was traded back and forth, when we consider those different categories, goods, plants, animals, and diseases, we begin to see that the Europeans really had the balance sheet in their favor. Of course, it was the Europeans that brought in gunpowder, cannons and muskets, horses, modern navies, and even some huge dogs that could wreak havoc on the Native Americans. They also brought with them smallpox, which was a terrible disease that just ravaged the Native Americans. It wasn't as if the Native Americans had not experienced disease or illness before. It's just that they were not prepared for this particular kind of disease or illness. And smallpox is an extremely brutal disease that kills very quickly, and it will kill a lot of Native Americans. If the smallpox didn't get the Native Americans, by the way, they could also succumb to other diseases they weren't prepared for by way of immunity. Measles, influenza, mumps, typhus, diphtheria, and plague. So the Europeans brought a lot of disease into the New World. They could also sometimes be very, very brutal with the Native Americans. In fact, there was a priest in the Spanish Empire, Bartolomé Las Casas, who, of course, decried the brutality that the Spanish, kind of meted out against the Native Americans, and were very, very. He was extremely upset about that, and felt that the one mission of conquest had really superseded the other mission of conversion to Catholicism. And so we know that the Europeans could be brutal, but if we want to know what really affected the Native Americans and made them so vulnerable, it really has to be disease. And of course, it wasn't always the Europeans the ones that were spreading the disease. It was oftentimes Native Americans themselves. There were oftentimes Native American tribes that had had very little contact with Europeans, but had become ravaged by disease as a result of other Native Americans traveling into their tribes, into their cities, or villages, I should say. Now, the Europeans were also exposed to disease from the Native Americans. Syphilis is probably the most common, but of course syphilis, if you compare syphilis to smallpox, they're both catastrophic, but the one takes a very long time to play out, syphilis. The other is very quick, and so when you think about just the mismatch, it was really a bad thing for the Native Americans to deal with the problems of smallpox and other diseases. Other things that we can mention with the Columbian Exchange is, of course, the food that will be taken from the Americas to Europe, which in many ways will spur a population explosion. Scholars sometimes go back and forth about why Europe had their population explosion at the time of the Age of Exploration, but a big part of it has got to be because of the crops that came from the Americas. And just to really focus in on this, the book mentions America gave Italy the tomato, France the string bean, Ireland the potato, to say nothing of chocolate and raspberries, its gifts to mankind. These were all new things that came from the Americas and deeply affected the European way of life. Of course, the Europeans also found that what they brought into the Americas flourished. So if we think about chickens and mules and oxen and other draft animals, horses, of course, these would really take off. And of course, the introduction of wheat will also take off. But the most important thing that the Americas gave, the real staple, was this corn, maize. It was so important in terms of providing a hearty food supply, not only for the Native Americans, but for the Europeans. And of course, just to add a little bit to this, we should take notice of some of the cash crops that came from America, particularly sugarcane, which of course in many ways will set up a more brutal form of slavery because it's a very labor-intensive crop. The effect on thinking was also profound as a result of the Columbian Exchange. We can really talk about Europeans becoming far more interested in botanical and biological classification as a result of their exploration of the Americas. And of course, classifying things from a biological perspective is the touchstone of what we will later refer to as the scientific revolution. So Sir Francis Bacon's contributions to science are occurring at the very same time that we're having this exploration going on, and that's very, very important. All of this, tended to promote in the minds of the Europeans when they took a look at their great success in the Americas, whether it be the conquests of some of these great Native American civilizations, whether it be the introduction of some of the technology and some of the food and animal elements into the New World, whether it be the disease that ravaged the Native Americans, whether it be all the new knowledge that was really taking off as a result of the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. Europeans could very quickly kind of decide that they had a superior civilization, and that this superior civilization was a rationale for some of the brutality that they meted out to the Native Americans, that it was kind of a justification. And this became rather insidious because, as we know, Native Americans will be by and large wiped out as a result of European exploration of the Americas. And a big component of that was that the Europeans were okay with that, and they were willing to let that happen, in part because they didn't know why it was happening, if you think of disease, but also because of this notion of superiority. So it's important to keep in mind this notion of kind of Eurocentrism when thinking about the conquest of the Americas. I just want to finish here with chapter 1 here for today by reading a passage from the book at the very end, and to have us kind of think about its significance. The authors state, "The arrival of Europeans did not therefore simply add to an American mosaic of peoples that had been thousands of the years in the making. There could be no middle way between idolatry and Christianity, barbarism and civilization, no celebration of diversity. Europeans knew that their ways and beliefs were superior and would triumph over those of their rivals." So the book is trying to say here that based on how everything played out, this, if we take theme 1, this Native American set of civilizations squaring off against theme 2, the Europeans' arrival, kind of resulting in theme 3, which of course is the Columbian Exchange. The authors are essentially saying all of this seemed to prove to the Europeans that they were superior and therefore had a right to dominate and conquer the Americas. So all of what we talk about these days in terms of diversity and multiculturalism and appreciation of this, that was simply not present in the European mindset. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be a lot of combination of Native American and European culture. In fact, we'll see some hybrids that are quite interesting as we move on. But by and large, the Europeans were convinced, as the way that history had played out, that the New World was theirs to dominate, and they would dominate, despite the very skillful adaptations that the Native Americans made in the New World. The Europeans would sweep a lot of that aside and install their systems. They would push their way of life, and in some cases this would have very tragic consequence. But of course it will also be the touchstone of what we will eventually refer to as the American experiment, an experiment in concepts such as freedom and democracy. And so we will look for that to unfold in subsequent chapters. Thank you. You've been a very attentive audience if you stuck with me the whole time. I apologize for any misstatements or errors that I might have made, but by and large, I think we covered the major topics of this chapter, and hopefully this will help prepare you for your quiz on Friday. Thanks again.